Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling a question.
Oh, yeah.
I know a lot of you out there have probably thought about this one.
Mm-hmm.
Can there be like a bigger purpose to
Yeah,
mental illness?
that's a big one.
Yeah, it's a big one. So we're going to be looking at this question through the lens of one of our listener questions
Right.
that was posed to a spiritual teacher.
Okay.
And before we kind of unpack the answer, let's hear the question itself.
Sounds good.
Because it really does kind of set the stage for this whole deep dive.
Yeah.
So
Lay it on us.
let's hear it. All right, so that was our listener's question. And you know what immediately struck me was how the listener kind of drew a parallel to the violence of the 20th century, the millions of lives
Millions and millions.
that were lost.
Yeah.
And it kind of makes you wonder if seemingly negative events can actually serve some greater purpose.
It does make you think about that, for sure.
Yeah, what do you think?
Well, it's a powerful analogy, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the speaker's response really kind of challenges us to consider a perspective that goes beyond our individual understanding of suffering.
Okay.
Like they're suggesting that maybe the way we typically view mental illness is just too limited.
Okay. I'm all ears. How so?
So the speaker argues that we often misunderstand suffering because we see ourselves as like separate and isolated individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, they propose this concept of one consciousness,
Okay.
suggesting that we are all interconnected expressions of a single unified awareness.
One consciousness, that's a big idea.
It is.
Can you break that down a little further for me? I think some of our listeners might be wondering what that actually means.
Sure. So think of it this way, like imagine a forest ecosystem.
Okay.
Each tree, each animal,
Mm.
even the tiny microorganisms in the soil, they're all interconnected.
Right.
Their individual actions contribute to the overall health and balance of the entire forest.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe humanity is like that forest, with each of us playing a part in the evolution of consciousness as a whole.
So instead of seeing ourselves as like these isolated individuals, we're more like individual cells within a larger organism.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Okay.
And the speaker suggests that this one consciousness uses the material world with all its challenges and complexities as a way to learn, grow, and express itself more fully.
That's a fascinating concept. It almost makes the material world sound like a school for consciousness.
Yeah, I like that.
But where does mental illness fit into all of this?
So that's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
The speaker uses the term blockages to describe anything that hinders the expression of our true potential.
Okay.
So think of limiting beliefs, negative emotional patterns, even physical ailments.
Mm-hmm.
In this framework, mental illness could be seen as a type of blockage.
So instead of simply viewing mental illness as a disorder or a malfunction, we could see it as a blockage that's somehow impeding the flow of this larger consciousness.
Exactly. It's like a dam in a river. The dam may cause disruptions and challenges, but it can also force the river to change course, carve new paths, to ultimately become something greater than it was before.
So these blockages, these challenges, they might actually be catalysts for growth and evolution, even if they're incredibly difficult to experience on an individual level?
That's the idea that the speaker is proposing.
Okay.
Of course, this doesn't diminish the very real pain and suffering that individuals with mental illness experience,
Right.
but it offers a different lens through which to view that suffering, one that might open up new possibilities for understanding and healing.
Okay. I'm starting to see how this perspective challenges our typical way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
It shifts the focus from the individual to the collective, and it suggests that even experiences that seem negative or destructive might actually be contributing to a larger, more complex process.
Precisely. And this leads us to another intriguing point that the speaker brings up the idea that what's considered mental illness in one culture might be seen as spiritual awakening in another.
That's a great point. I remember reading about how some indigenous cultures view individuals who hear voices or have visions as shamans or healers, whereas in Western cultures, those same experiences might be diagnosed as psychosis.
Exactly.
It really makes you question our assumptions about what's normal and what's not.
Exactly. And the speaker suggests that some individuals revered as saints and masters in Eastern traditions might be labeled mentally ill if they were living in the West today.
That's fascinating. It suggests that perhaps we need to be more open-minded about the range of human experience and consider that what we call mental illness might sometimes be a different way of perceiving or interacting with reality.
That's right, and perhaps those different ways of perceiving reality, even if they're challenging or disruptive, can ultimately contribute to the evolution of consciousness in ways we can't fully grasp from our limited individual perspectives.
Okay, so we've started to explore this concept of one consciousness and how it might relate to mental illness.
Yeah.
But I'm curious to dive deeper into the speaker's response. What specific insights do they offer about the potential purpose of these blockages?
Well, that's where it gets even more thought-provoking.
Okay.
The speaker suggests that these challenges, including mental illness, might actually be necessary for the unfolding of consciousness on a global scale.
Whoa. Okay, now we're really getting into some uncharted territory.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
So the speaker uses this powerful metaphor from the Bible,
Okay.
the birth pangs of the New Age.
Okay.
They're suggesting that humanity as a whole is going through this process of transformation and awakening,
Mm-hmm.
and that this process is inherently challenging, even painful, just like childbirth.
Okay, I can see where they're going with that. Childbirth is intense.
Yeah.
But it ultimately brings new life into the world. Are they saying that our collective struggles, including mental illness, are like the birth pangs of a new era of consciousness?
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And the speaker emphasizes that recognizing the insanity of violence, the suffering we inflict on each other and on ourselves, is a crucial part of this awakening.
So facing our shadows, our collective dysfunction, is part of the process of birthing this new age.
Right.
It's definitely a thought-provoking concept, but I have to admit it raises some questions for me.
Sure.
If all experiences, even painful ones, contribute to this evolution of consciousness, does that diminish our individual choices? Does it mean that our actions don't really matter?
That's a valid concern, and it's something that a lot of people grapple with when they first encounter this perspective.
Right.
The speaker addresses this directly by emphasizing that we still have free will
Okay.
and that our choices have consequences.
Mm-hmm.
This idea of one consciousness doesn't negate our individuality or our responsibility for our actions.
So it's not a free pass to behave however we want and say, well, it's all part of the plan anyway.
Exactly. The speaker isn't advocating for passivity or inaction in the face of suffering.
Okay.
In fact, they explicitly state that we should still offer help and support to those who are struggling both individually and collectively.
That makes sense. It's about recognizing the interconnectedness of all things without losing sight of our individual agency and our responsibility to care for one another.
That's a great way to put it. It's like each of us is holding a piece of a giant jigsaw puzzle.
Okay.
We might only see our own piece up close, but if we step back and look at the whole picture, we can see how all the pieces fit together to create something much larger and more complex than we could have imagined on our own.
That's a helpful analogy. It reminds me that our individual perspective is always limited, but that doesn't mean we can't strive to understand the bigger picture.
Right.
So if we apply this to mental illness, are they saying that it's just a piece of this larger puzzle, a piece that we may not fully understand from our current vantage point?
Precisely. And the speaker acknowledges that they don't fully understand why things are this way,
Mm-hmm.
why suffering exists, why mental illness is part of the human experience.
Right.
But they observe this pattern of growth and evolution emerging from these seemingly insurmountable obstacles.
Okay, so it's not about having all the answers, but about recognizing that there might be a larger picture at play, even if we can't see it clearly from where we're standing.
Yes, and that recognition can be both humbling and empowering. And stay humbling because it reminds us that we don't have all the answers.
Right.
Empowering because it suggests that even our struggles, our pain, our perceived failures might be contributing to something greater than ourselves.
It's kind of like the saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but on a much grander scale.
I like that, though. Perhaps it's more nuanced than simply becoming stronger.
Right.
It's about the potential for transformation, for evolving into something new, something more expansive and compassionate.
So even if we don't fully grasp the why behind mental illness, we can still explore how it might fit into this larger process of consciousness unfolding.
Exactly. And the speaker points out that if we identify solely with our individual selves, with our limited lifespan and experiences, then death seems like a total loss,
Yeah.
a terrifying end. But if we see ourselves as expressions of this larger consciousness, then death takes on a different meaning.
It becomes less about the end of an individual and more about a transition within this larger unfolding of awareness. It's a comforting thought, actually.
I think so, too.
Yeah.
And the speaker suggests that this realization can be incredibly liberating.
Yeah, okay.
It allows us to connect to a sense of purpose that transcends our individual lives and fears.
It's almost like we're all actors in a giant cosmic play.
Yeah,
And each role, no matter how challenging or painful, contributes to the overall story.
right.
Even the villains and the tragic heroes have their part to play.
I love that analogy. It really
Yeah.
captures the idea that we're all contributing to this unfolding of consciousness, whether we're aware of it or not.
And it brings us back to that initial question, what is the purpose of mental illness?
Right.
So is the speaker suggesting that mental illness is just a role that some of us are playing in this cosmic drama?
It's not quite that simple. Remember, they point out that some mental illness might actually be misdiagnosed spiritual awakening.
Right.
They also acknowledge that sometimes consciousness goes slightly wrong, which could be another way of describing certain mental health conditions.
So there's no one-size-fits-all answer. Mental illness is a complex phenomenon, and there might be different ways it fits into this larger picture of consciousness evolving.
Exactly, and I think that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about finding definitive answers,
Mm-hmm.
but about expanding our perspective, challenging our assumptions, and asking ourselves some really difficult questions.
Questions that most of us probably avoid thinking about on a daily basis.
Like, if we are all part of this one consciousness, does that mean we're all responsible for each other's suffering? Or if consciousness is evolving through every experience, does that include the experiences we create through our choices?
Whoa, those are some heavy questions. And honestly, they make me a little uncomfortable.
Yeah,
But I also think it's important to grapple with them. Avoiding difficult questions doesn't make them go away.
I agree, and I think the speaker would too. They're not offering easy answers, but they're inviting us to engage with these ideas in a thoughtful and compassionate way.
So what are we left with after exploring this perspective? What do we do with all of this?
Well, I think we're left with a much more complex and nuanced understanding of suffering, particularly mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just a problem to be solved or a burden to be endured. It might be a piece of a much larger puzzle, a piece that, however painful, ultimately contributes to the evolution of consciousness.
I'm definitely going to be pondering these ideas for a while.
Me too.
It's a lot to digest.
And I hope our listeners are doing the same.
Yeah.
We've covered so much ground in this deep dive,
Yeah, we have.
but I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
I agree. There's always more to explore. Speaking of which, this idea of interconnectedness, of one consciousness experiencing itself through all of us.
Right.
It makes me think about the interconnectedness of our own minds and bodies. We've been talking about this idea of one consciousness and how it might relate to mental illness, but it also makes me think about the interconnectedness of our own minds and bodies. Like,
Yeah.
have you ever noticed how your physical health can impact your mental state and vice versa?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how intertwined they are when we're stressed or anxious.
Mm.
It often manifests physically, headaches, muscle tension, digestive issues.
Right.
And when we're physically unwell, it can definitely impact our mood and mental clarity.
Yeah, it's like our minds and bodies are constantly in communication, influencing each other in subtle and profound ways. And if we consider this idea of one consciousness, perhaps that interconnectedness extends beyond our individual bodies to encompass like a larger web of interconnectedness.
That's a really intriguing thought. If we're all expressions of this one consciousness, as the speaker suggests, perhaps our individual minds and bodies are like nodes in a vast network, constantly sending and receiving signals, influencing and being influenced by the whole.
That's a beautiful image. It makes me think about the concept of collective consciousness, the idea that our thoughts, emotions, and beliefs can actually impact the world around us.
Exactly. And perhaps that collective consciousness, in turn, influences our individual experiences, shaping our perceptions, beliefs, and even our physical well-being.
So it's a two-way street. We're both influencing and being influenced by this larger field of consciousness. This whole conversation has been incredibly thought-provoking. But I have to admit, the idea that individual suffering could be part of some larger impersonal process of evolution is still a tough one to wrap my head around.
It's definitely a paradox.
Yeah.
How can something that feels so personal, so isolating, so destructive, also be contributing to something greater than ourselves?
Right.
It's like those optical illusions where you see one image up close,
Oh, yeah.
but then you step back and it transforms into something entirely different.
That's a great analogy. We're so focused on the individual pieces of the puzzle, the immediate experience of suffering, that we miss the larger picture that's emerging from all those pieces combined. But doesn't that diminish the reality of individual pain if it's all just part of some grand cosmic plan? Does that mean our suffering doesn't really matter?
That's where compassion comes in. Even if we entertain this idea of a larger purpose, we can't lose sight of the fact that suffering is real and that it hurts acknowledging that pain, holding space for it, is essential, even as we try to understand it from a brighter perspective.
So it's not about invalidating individual experiences, but holding that individual experience alongside this idea of a collective evolution of consciousness, two seemingly contradictory truths existing simultaneously.
Exactly. Yes, suffering is real and can be devastating.
Right.
And perhaps it's also playing a role in something much larger than we can currently comprehend. It's about expanding our capacity to hold multiple perspectives, to embrace complexity and paradox.
It's a lot like having faith in something we can't fully see or understand, trusting that there's a bigger picture, even when all we can see is our own little corner of the world.
Maybe. Or maybe it's about cultivating a sense of curiosity and open-mindedness. We might never have all the answers, but that doesn't mean we stop asking questions and exploring different possibilities.
And perhaps that exploration itself is part of the process, the act of questioning, grappling with these complex ideas, pushing the boundaries of our understanding. Maybe that's how consciousness evolves.
That's a fascinating thought it brings to mind, the idea that consciousness isn't static. It's constantly growing and changing through our experiences, our reflections, our struggles.
So even wrestling with these uncomfortable ideas, even feeling confused or uncertain, that could be part of the journey. It's not about arriving at a final destination, but about embracing the journey itself.
Absolutely. And perhaps that discomfort, that sense of being stretched beyond our comfort zones, is a sign that we're expanding our awareness, growing in ways we never thought possible.
This has been a truly mind-bending deep dive. It's challenged us to consider some really big existential questions about the nature of consciousness suffering and the interconnectedness of all things.
And while we may not have come away with definitive answers, I think we've gained a deeper appreciation for the complexity and mystery of human experience.
Absolutely. We've explored some radical ideas today, but I think the most important takeaway, at least for me, is the reminder that we're not alone in our struggles.
Yeah,
We're all part of something much larger than ourselves, and even our pain, our confusion, our darkest moments might be playing a role in the evolution of consciousness.
that's a beautiful way to sum it up. And I hope our listeners feel a sense of connection, of possibility, of hope, even in the face of life's inevitable challenges.
As always, the journey of discovery continues. Thanks for diving in with us. We'll see you next time on the Deep Dive Assess.